Hello everyone, today we talk about the notion of Byzantine history. And this is a video that I should have done since the very beginning of Schwerpunkt. If anything, for a matter of historical orientation, we will talk about that in a while. And I promise I would make this as a kind of a heartbreaking video after all, a sort of video confession, heartbreaking confession on what at this point I really see this topic about, and I don't even dare to call it like what I see Byzantine history like or Roman history like. I don't even know how long this video is gonna last because it's a really bit complicated to make a point about this topic, right? And this is one of those topics that you can't be sure that whenever in any way it's discussed, it will make you gain some love and some hate at the same time, likes and dislikes depending on where you stand with the issue. And I don't want to simplify the question as saying banally there are people who believe that the term Byzantine is right or wrong, or what does it even mean to say it's right or wrong. But in fact, to point out why this is such a huge deal, apparently, of why in a great part, considering the whole historical spectrum and the whole same temporal and even spatial context in which the Roman Empire, medieval times, is about, is probably not to be a huge deal, at least in relation with all the rest that happens out there, as this problem is grossly overemphasized in my opinion, and for reasons that in fact have barely to do with any historical accuracy of sort, right? This is the conclusion I came up over time. I can say I'm fed up with it because I still think in fact it's a fascinating question, but I'm annoyed in general by how the problem is posed in popular culture. And popular culture here actually does something positive, right? We always criticize how popular culture does this or that, everybody's wrong, right? And all this stuff. But I think it's important to start from one important knowledge, that is that Byzantine history, as we define it, at least in this way now, is a topic that has gained, especially in the last decades, I presume 2 decades, with for reasons now we'll try to explain, but it's simply a very important place in popular culture. Like from all the things that objectively the masses do not care even about in historical terms, Byzantine history, or whatever you want to call it, has emerged as as a pole of interest for many people, mostly young people, and here probably the reasons are connected not much with, in fact, a true historical awareness in a broader spectrum, right? Probably, of course, these people like the Byzantine Empire because they evidently know something about it, so that there is a higher awareness in absolute terms, but this still doesn't equate in many ways, in especially that specific subculture that has developed around historicism, and that nobody can make me think didn't emerge but from essentially from video gaming, right? From that same generation from which I stem myself. And I can tell you, because I went through the whole process in some way, I'm not very different from that mass I'm talking about as a journey, as a path through how I got acquainted to these topics, how I began to study history, how I went on. So I don't want to sound elitistic, cathedratic, or forcefully original or pretentious about my opinion on the thing, but I've seen the thing from the within, right, as a phenomenon, as it went out, and from one side, especially as a medievalist that is not expert in Byzantine history, I'm pleasantly surprised to acknowledge that objectively Byzantine history has gained an importance out there. The reasons here are very complex to analyze. We can't narrow it down just to, lots of kids played video games, which, they discovered that there was a Byzantine Empire in the first place. They got passionate about it. They kind of projected on it many different ideologies sometimes that in part have messed up the thing, right? Has taken away the good aspects in some part that this new awareness had acknowledged. But definitely the thing started as well from the more serious hierarchies, from the academies, right? And from some generation, it's even difficult to frame this. If I were in fact an expert in Byzantine history and historiography, I could be more precise. But there has been a renewed interest in the, I can say, the very last generations. It's something we could trace back even back to 1 century, right, or more, towards this part of properly Western history that has been largely more than ignored, really misrepresented, and stereotyped, and however dealt with in a way that we didn't do with Western Europe, more properly at that time, and eventually with the rest of, and of what descended properly from that tradition, right? This is not a problem that it's just about Constantinople and her empire. This is really about a lot of other issues, including, for example, Eastern Europe, the Orthodox world, right, over the Catholic or the Protestant one, that in turn is also intertwined with lots of other events, with what the history of other countries, from from Tsarist Russia to the Ottoman invasions, or to the same Cold War and socialist, this Eastern socialist part of Europe, in that eventually we still have to address historiographically speaking, because certain things are not over yet. Think about the Balkanic question, right? That's not over. That's something that began back in the day. In many ways, it's not over yet. And look at what is happening in the Near East, or in the Eastern Mediterranean just in these days. What's still the role of certain countries, and how difficult it is objectively to have I can say a neutral talk, as history should practically be, methodologically speaking at least, but just an objective one when addressing certain issues. I've personally noticed when, since I started Schwerpunkt, but also from previous experience, that when you start talking about a certain part of history, and even of certain areas of, in this case of Europe, but we could extend it to more than that, of course, especially in this case, by the way, considering the 3 continents that Byzantine Empire is stretched on, at least at some point, to even have a talk in the first place, that people get triggered by apparently the most idiotic matters that not only reveal the extreme kind of hatred and bitterness about certain aspects that are legitimately they're at least motivated, historically speaking, but also the sheer and total or absolute ignorance about any kind of actual historical awareness of what the past has been. Right? Let's be very frank about this issue, because we will have to come back on it during the course of the video. We still live in a world in which, if you're a Westerner, broadly meant, you have been raised definitely not, you can say, in the perfect world, or even in one that had that could teach you concretely this great history. Because let's be honest about it, as I've repeated many times, yes, the West may be the best educated area in the world, but still, for being the best educated area in the world, still being better than everybody else in this regard, has disgustingly gross historical under-scholarization. The historical awareness of any country in the world is utterly disgusting. There's not a single country, a single nation, a single people in this world that has actually a clear, spread, solid historical competence, awareness, objectivity, concreteness. There is not, right? And the more we went on, we address a bit these issues here and there sometimes, but still there is no interest or even any any talk, any serious talk at the end of the day about what our education should be about, how we should be looking at the past in a properly teaching / learning sense. Like, of course, historians will keep working closely in their studies in their academies and so on, but we have seen fundamentally that culture has its own problems as well. First of all, when it's of a good historiographical tradition, even, right? Like half of the West now seemingly has gone literally crazy in terms of historiographical, determining what is deontologically history should actually be. And that's an enormously serious thing, because never give for granted that that the West cannot turn once again into chaos and essentially regressing on every level, right? And once again, this is a lot to do with what we're talking about today, because I can tell you directly, look at what happened at the Byzantines, but that's a pretty good example of how things can't definitely, there is nothing deterministically written here in this regard. But also, it seems to me that the main problem in absolute terms, in a world that is unavoidably ever more globalized, and there is literally nothing, and I stress this, nothing that you can do to do otherwise, unless there is like a kind of a third world war, we all regress to to the Stone Age and we restart from zero. That we're talking about in terms of how should we have a dialogue with the rest of the world about the importance of historical objectivity and awareness, right? We have as the West many allies in that world that is not conceived fully as Western in some ways. I don't know, there are kind of weird categories in many ways that Japan by some is considered a Western country, Brazil is not, for example. There are these paradoxes, but think about many other big, large countries, including this ones, for example, that, you could say, what's the actual historical awareness of these people? How do the Japanese actually know about what they have done in China during World War II, or how much they study in their history books? The question is, if they don't, and they really skip the thing, and they still kind of deny that, you have a problem, right? Because you can rely on allies for political, strategical reasons. You can think that you keep the world under control, but history has showed us repeatedly that you can't keep this thing under control, right? We have been raised in a world in which, okay, we were the richest, the smartest, the most capable, the happiest, right? We were rising, there was no cloud ahead. Then one day, one unfortunate day, with some prodromes, but we found out at the very beginning of this millennium that evidently things are not really like this. And it seems that overall, some of the things have really gone dramatically downhill, because essentially there's been a contraction. It's never been a crisis, a stagnation, sometimes a recession as well, but still it's more of a crisis than an actual decline. But yet this crisis entails that we have to deal with worlds that do not necessarily have the same I can say capacity of dialogue, but properly the intellectual tools to deal with certain historical questions, right? If Erdogan, for example, can say that, I don't know, now the Turkish Navy has to go out there in Libya like Barbarossa did back then in the 16th century, right? That's politics, right? And that's not representative of the average Turkish person. I don't think so. I want to think it's not, right? I don't have, even in here, I don't make false expectations, because I've seen the most idiotic things said and believed in Western countries, and definitely the outer I go from there, the more I realize how truly scary it is out there. But evidently, in the context of NATO, for example, in this case, or given this historical past, the question is, what are we doing all this for, right? What does it mean? Like, how do we think that the ideals, for example, that we came up after World War II here, still work with the current society? And the question is reversible in the sense that, should they? Because to me, the answer is definitively yes, right? Yeah, and the main problem is actually that what we believe we had founded after World War II still had a lot of faults, right? That essentially derived from not having followed thoroughly the basis that the properly civic and institutional and even political promises we had made at that point were truly fine, in my opinion. And ever since the beginning, we failed those things, right? You can't look at here. We starting talking about history of the second half of the 20th century. That's definitely not what we have to do. But the question is, there is even in here an idea that, coming back properly in Byzantine history, we can't talk about. That is that we properly, as countries, as cultures broadly met, aside from what our intelligentsia can do, aside from what all the publications we can ever imagine can do, is still looking at history essentially in an identitarist sense. Right? There is the idea that there is a specific stigma attached to you. Doesn't matter where you come from, you are insertable in that package, right? You are, more or less, this comes from a more or less sophisticated historiographical construction of some sort. Today, it's even, up to this point, it has worked as long as at least the nation state was, was something functional. Even today, the thing is crumbling at every level. Together with the nation state we have known, and here it's not really important what you stand on the position, whether it's positive or negative. I don't care at this point to talk about this, because it's also poorly phrased in this regard. But the point is, today we're dumbing that. I mean, it already sucked as a pattern of interpretation. Now we're dumbing it down to even things like race, right? That you should be defined, for example, by the kind of, how you look like, which basically means to surrender all the true meaning of civilization in a single dimensional thought, right? If there is something that we had managed to evolve from, is, saying, okay, we live in a meritocratic society where everybody starts from equal opportunities, right? And then they go out there and they do the best they can, and they go on with their life as free as they can. No, now everything is dramatically, darkly enclosing on new ideologies that fundamentally draw you into groups that you don't even want to belong to, because you don't even believe that they are actual groups, right? And they shouldn't matter for a civilized society, an advanced and intelligent, a respectable, a worthy society. And while everything is crumbling, right, you go look at these new, subcultures that emerge, such as the ones that are fans of the Byzantine Empire, and you find out strange things. That it is not, after all, about knowing about what the Roman Empire at that time really was, or, what you really care, but it's just putting yourself in function of it. That is to say, where did I stand? Where do I stem from? What color I was at the time? Was I a Roman? Or, for example, attaching to the idea of Romanity, a kind of a national thing. I've seen it happening, right? Stating that a people was, for example, the true Romans because, that because of the Byzantine period where the capital had migrated and adopted it in a national sense. Or, this emphatic attention towards the identity character of the empire, as if every single subject of the Roman Empire had actually believed that they were part of that picture that we actually study from the most elitistic and aristocratic and hierarchical levels of the empire itself, right? Do you think that the Byzantine Empire was actually that, in a real sense, that perfectly hierarchical and hierarchically organized and unmovable and traditionalist and communitarian and conservative monolith that always maintained those true values since ancient times, and that these people weren't just basically the same people that have always existed everywhere in the world at every same time, and that were just trying to make a polity work, and that even if you truly believed in certain values, they were still people realizing that when you enter into politics that everything is a farce, or at least you have to definitely stand on some firm points, but then how the thing is going to turn out really depends on you. This empire was definitely not meant to be eternal because it ended. It was definitely not meant to be an ecumenic one at the end of the day. There was nothing teleological about it, right? These are normal polities, right, that are identitarily, specifically drawn, but at some levels that, however, change all the time. There is here now we can't expand properly the matter. For example, there is all the if you look at the titling of the Byzantine emperors, right? There is the idea that somewhat the thing always remained the same. That at a certain point it was a switch from Latin to Greek. There were other terms. Things changed continuously. Actually, the terms, the titles, views, the formalities. There were some common characters that we can draw, but they weren't, for example, a specialty of the Byzantines in that regard. An element that we have forgotten is definitely that at the time every empire was kind of spiritual and with universalistic ambition and divinely inspired. Right, every single power. There wasn't like the good one, there was the special one, right? There was the powerful one that could maybe export and, and with its connections and influence, its models and being imitated, and others trying to share part of its power as long as it was actually powerful. But there is nothing here that works because, one reality has always been the same, or should have always been the same. And what we can look at in history is exactly this one today, that we cannot stick, even historiographically speaking, to concepts that fundamentally cannot change. And you would say, but this is essentially a video about a definition. That is to say, we're waiting for you to say, is it good or not to call the empire Byzantine, or should we call it Roman or Eastern Roman, which is the worst thing you can ever do in absolute terms. And we'll explain why. But the point is, every time the only thing actually when I got into this, subcultures about it, were fascinated about it, the Byzantine Empire, you realize that they don't give a freaking damn about the story. Just invent the symbol that they presume the empire actually was, because they heard it from somewhere, they heard the cool kids talking about it in that term, and they can't quote a pair of books that state a phrase and thinking that they should go on for all the rest of their lives with that interpretation and not switching on their own brains. And therefore, the best thing you can hear from that, oh, it was not Byzantine but Roman. How dare you to call it in that way? That's something that I attribute, intellectually speaking, at the level of 19, 20 years old. Like after you go up the first year of university, you already are in the second one. You should be emotionally kind of able to let it go. That's the process of maturity, hopefully taking its place. But hey, we already know that it doesn't matter how old you are, that has basically nothing to do on what your emotional maturity is. There are people who have 80 years old and they have the mind of a child, and as such you should treat them. Like, just know that I have no sympathy whatsoever for, no preference whatsoever for anyone. The only exception I make a little bit is for children, because children objectively, like, they don't, there's something that they don't understand at some level, and you can't excuse them for. But once you're an adult, I don't care how old you are, which gender you are, where you come from, which titles you have. If you say something stupid because you presume that you can't talk about things you do not know, and just lecturing others, especially with your mistakes, you're an idiot. And there it stays, right? And we all do this. This is interesting, right? I can't tell you that I don't do that. Who knows how many times I make a mistake, but at least my philosophy is, okay, first of all, if I make a mistake, and acknowledge that, once I found out it's a mistake, and this is also a problem, we'll have to come back on the course of the video. Secondly, correcting the mistake. That is to say, okay, I was wrong, so, it's fine, I've learned something, I've enriched myself, so I can go on with the correct thing, and I can benefit from that. That's cool, and that's what a mature person should do. Then whether I'm able to do it or not, or whoever is able to do it or not, this is another matter, and that's where the actual discriminant between the mature and the immature person. But when it comes to Byzantine history, the first question I say is, how does the rest of these same people that are so, fun based on the Byzantine Empire, how much do they actually know about history in the first place? Like, focusing specifically on a certain polity, for whichever reason it is, and you can easily find it in many other places, right? That grows under scholarization in Western countries is often equated to things like, I think that, the only thing that exists in the world is my country, because I have a bunch of, nationalist relatives that told me that ever since I was born, and therefore I will keep repeating the same thing they do, and I will not step out of my ignorance, because that simply I don't need that, and I will go on thinking that everything revolves around my country, and that my failures as an individual person can be essentially forgiven to be part, to have a citizenship of a piece of land that has a flag that is different from the others, right? All the totalitarianisms, all the dictatorships, all the authoritarian regimes have always, and they still do because they still exist, by the way, have always tried to give the radically ignorant masses of slaves they control the false idea that they understand their own history, right? Go to countries that, had, socialism, communism up to a few decades ago, and look at how people actually still think in those, even those that are happy actually that the Soviet Union is over, for example. Still look at how much they remain impressed, with the idea that after all their country is their own thing that nobody can touch. You can never talk bad about it. They're always the pure, innocent martyrs that have always been good, and there is no stain in their past. I don't think that in Western Europe, in the Atlantic Alliance, we're any different, right? This happens everywhere. It happens in Europe. It happens in the United States. It happens basically in every country in the world, just with different degrees, right? And that degrees varies exactly with the degree of historical ignorance that people have, that they think they have. Because historically speaking, if you don't know something, you don't get interested in history, okay, there are certain things you simply can't understand, right? It's, when you log on Facebook, or that I have Facebook like for since 10 years, and I never posted a single thing on there because it was just to connect with my, high school, mates and and other people I knew. But I never, I've used other accounts, but I never used that. And the few times that I got there, because now Facebook sends me a notification even if I'm on the other account, it comes across some news of people that are my age now that should have had kind of an advanced education or something, and they actually had, and they still come out there with some of the most radical political ideologies, things that are so dumb that, what do you think the world has never gotten to them? What do you think things never work this way? Because maybe we are not supposed to work that way, or maybe the thing is a tiny bit more complex than that. But no, we need to dumb things down. So I am actually, and I can point it out very honestly here, that I am actually for calling the Byzantine Empire Roman Empire. I mean, it's not even a personal opinion of mine. Like, that was the Roman Empire, right? So much that I get very triggered, for example, when I read things like, you shouldn't be saying Byzantine Empire, you should be saying Eastern Roman Empire. You see, that's exactly the degree of stupidity that I was talking about before, right? Because that thing never, ever called itself, not even a single time, historically speaking, not even when the empire was partitioned in two halves that were still existing, it never called itself Eastern or Western Roman Empire. It never happened. Never, right? And if you really want to lecture someone and say, don't use the term Byzantine because it's derogatory, allegedly, as if, words are, have also just a fixed semantic meaning, right? That we could make extensive parallelisms with racism, like calling people colored, for example. How is it not racist to call a person colored? It's one of the most radically idiotic thing you can ever say, right? And it reveals the schizophrenic, puritanic obsession and hypocrisy that revolves around this concept, right? The same goes for Byzantine history, which is a term that has been naturally used by Westerners for derogatory terms, but that for specific historiographical reasons now has emerged as a distinct branch of studies that bears this name, that the scholars of which are called Byzantinists and so on, but that objectively acknowledges, because guess why, that's all what they study for their own life, that of course the term Byzantine is wrong. But at the same time, that in our culture, and this is a deep realization and interiorization of the thing, it has had a special meaning of sort for which we still call it like that, and that in spite, we should hope and try to go past that, to start calling things with the names they actually have. It still has an importance expressed in that terms that today actually has turned towards a more positive one, right? The Roman Empire has always called itself Roman Empire, right? It was like the eastern half, the western half, but that's an administrative partition. The two halves were called Roman Empire. There was no eastern or western attached. And the most stupid things you can do ever, if you want to lecture someone not using the term Byzantine, is to call that empire Eastern Roman Empire, because that means by definition that you have not even the most elementary knowledge that you learn from every Byzantine history manual of the first year of any university, and frankly, you should have learned it in high school at the latest, as I already did, by the way, with no much of a, it was public school, okay, maybe, I live in the only country where public schools are better than private ones, but let's say that, that was not called like that, right? And that especially, even if you really want to use the term for saying, when there were the two halves that, they were separated administratively, and they kind of had different rulers in that regard, which is usually done even there. Let's not descend into details, because the empire was partitioned even in more than two halves, and that there was also back and forth in that regard. But when Odoacer sent back the insignia of the West to Constantinople, there is nothing properly like the Eastern Roman Empire, or that had never been, telling the truth. And even when that probably, switches off theoretically the western half, because, the Justinian reconquered theoretically what was still thought to be the western half, but now in a very modified situation, for which it was just Constantinople invading the western Mediterranean. to tell it all, and we'll have to talk about this in turn. Then there is just Constantinople. There is nothing else, right? Yeah, there are other centers that are the metropolitic seats, that there is a universalistic empire, the head of a church, right? That, by the way, is not the only one at that point, because Christianity spread also far and wide in ways that I didn't recognize, even within the same empire, as you probably know, because of all the heresies that existed, especially in the eastern half. The centers that reconnected, broadly speaking, to the center, to Constantinople, as even in there just as a political reality, because frankly, also the metropolitic seat of Constantinople was an artificial invention that had to make this city that up to that point hadn't been much of a deal for Byzantine. In fact, the new center of the world. Well, very gradually, by the way, because Constantine himself had, set those bases, but it's not that they started from the very beginning in those terms. They were part of this broader empire that, as an ecumenic one, and we have talked a lot on Schwerpunkt about the universalism in this regard of those times, not just for what concerned Constantinople, in fact, but in fact many other realities that nobody gives a freaking damn about. Right? Everybody likes Byzantine history. What about, Romano-Germanic kingdoms? How many people actually study that with the same degree of admiration or great? No, they say no, because those were barbarians. Yes, because you buy into the Roman propaganda of that, which was exactly aimed at making you think that chapeau to Roman propaganda. They all had their own propaganda. I'm not against the Romans in that regard at all. But that just tells how passively received historical notions from realities that today we studied at a level that frankly we could dispense of such superficial approaches to the matter, right? So if you really want to make a favor to someone, if you don't want to use the term Byzantine, use Roman and not Eastern Roman, because that's disgusting. Like the Byzantines would have been utterly disgusted to be called as Eastern Romans. Utterly disgusted, right? There are chances that they let's not go as far as that, but between Byzantine and Eastern Roman, we were at the same level of like outrage for Roman standards in that regard. The point we have to do here is also is the usage of the term Byzantine acceptable, and why should it be acceptable, right? Because the dumb thing is saying, okay, so they didn't call themselves Byzantines, so they call themselves Romans, we should call it Romans, fine. So why don't you call the Germans die Deutsche, for example, and you keep calling them Germans, right? Why do you, I don't know, every kind of nationality, every kind of country that you don't even know that it exists, every kind of language, even words that you borrow from other language, why don't you actually adapt them to this ridiculous standard of fake puritanic attitude towards language and historical conventions, right? Why do you think actually it's more important by 2020, like to point out that you should be saying Roman instead than Byzantine? What do you think that it actually shows about that you're a kind of an elevated person, that you are an expert of Byzantine history, that you have such this deep knowledge of the historical reality of those times because you point that out? Because I can tell you that objectively, most of the times I've seen people pointing that out for the sake of saying, okay, you're wrong, or simply this is how it should be said. That's where those people remain. Like all the people that I generally found who were actually expert in Byzantine history wouldn't even dream to make a fuss about the fact of, could make a joke, right? But not to reproach you because you use the term Byzantine, because guess what? Those same scholars are called Byzantinists all over the world, all over the academy, by universal standards, are named Byzantinists by themselves. So the people who study Byzantine history for a lifetime are fine to call their studies Byzantinistics, Byzantine studies. They call themselves Byzantinists. And what do you think that this kind of historical Nazi attitude to what a word should be used or not will actually bring to? Do you think that if we start calling the Byzantine Empire with its true name, which I personally don't have any problem to do, you know that we made at this point, I don't know, 50 videos about Byzantine history. I switch that constantly. Like, I use the term Byzantine now, explain which sense, but I use the term Roman, like in the same phrase, in the same video. It depends on what I want to stress, right? And actually, the term Byzantine in this regard is an element of enrichment, in my opinion, because it allows to actually shift the semantics to something that went beyond what we want to stress properly as the Roman continuity and of the same institutions of the same kind. The term Byzantine goes very far in terms. Think about art, right? What would you call, for example, the beautiful mosaics you can find in Venice or in Bulgaria, like Roman art? Yeah, but can't you be more specific? There is properly a Byzantine art. You can draw certain standards, right? Roman painting in 1st century AD wasn't like the Roman painting of the 11th century AD. And a huge deal of civilization passed through these changes. So to flatten the thing, to say, okay, what do you think? Do you think that we would have never... I understand the problem. I understand the problem that this thing was always the same entity, was always the same polity, right? That there were certain elements of change that do not justify the change properly of the name, because we don't change the history like of the name, the terminology of the Chinese Empire compared from the beginning to the end. We don't do it for other realities, but tendentially at that level. But it's not that there are many of that level, frankly, and there are many realities that we call with names that definitely they did not have all the time, right? We do it continuously. Right, we at this point, most people don't even know what kind of institutional government we have in most countries today in the world. Between republics, constitutional monarchies, federations. It's a big deal, right? We could extend this literally to every single thing, right? And you have to explain me why do you think that doing this for specifically the Roman Empire in medieval times has more importance than doing it for other empires that were out there at the time. And I realize even here the importance of this empire for the West and the world in more broadly. I understand that we have neglected this, that the same term Byzantine was derogatory at some point, but for example, it was posthumous, right? The term Byzantine was spread in the Netherlands and in Italy since I think the 16th century. The same Byzantines actually changed the name of the Roman polity. Just think about, if let's say Scipio Africanus had known for a second that the res publica populi Romani, which was the actual name of the Roman, and even in here we often say, we even split, for example, Roman Republic for Roman Empire. Do you know that that's a concept that, historically speaking, has no sense whatsoever if you actually know what's the res publica and what's the imperium in Roman history? But we keep doing that, but nobody points that out. Nobody gives a damn about it. Why? Because people have no idea, because they have never studied that. And don't make me believe that all people that come out that say you should say Roman instead of Byzantine are actually better than the average of the others, because it's not true, right? It's more likely, just academically speaking, that you're expert on things that are not Byzantine, because that's a minor part of the broader, scholarly historical spectrum. So it's definitely a popular phenomenon, and once again, it points out an interesting thing. It points out a true thing. Right, but once again, think if Scipio Africanus had known that the res publica populi Romani had been known one day Basileia ton Romaion. So a Greek name. Basileia means kingdom, basically. right? It's more semantically shaded, but that's fundamentally what it is. And okay, of the Romans, the Romagnol, do you think he would have been happy? Do you think he would have thought that was the same thing that the Roman Empire had been? I mean, even if he had known the whole history of it, do you think he would have actually accepted that? That, he would have said, well, okay, but after all, that's history as we see it in the 21st century. I will take it. No, right? So even in here, what's Roman actually? What was Roman to those people that began to think in a way or another that their polity had the right to rule over the world, and it was doing it with a completely like a religious military character of pagan background, with some of that see it in a monotheistic Near Eastern originated religious perspective. Did you think that that's comparable, that it actually even matters for us that we are at a dot in the universe to point out with the fact that our lives are limited, fragile, dramatically short, and that it's ever much later that you can ever imagine at whichever point in your life you are, that you can spend even a breath of word to point out something as you should say Roman instead, or even Eastern Roman, right? To strangle you at that point, that instead than Byzantine, right? That do you think that's useful in the whole economy of the sheer massive historiographical production that has been created since those times, that up to now the oceans of ink of publications written about Byzantine history every year, at this point, on always the same single topics. I mean, if you look at what is published, up to a few years ago on Constantine, that how much can you actually say about Constantine? Yeah, you can keep reevaluating certain historiographical perspective, but how do you think, maybe there is much more to say about, I don't know, 16th century Germany, or about early medieval Iberian Peninsula than making, hundreds of publications of Constantine, right? After millennia of historiography that has been revolving around trying to understand what this figure was, right? How do you think in the economy and in the if anything of intelligence, this is something virtuous or healthy, or that you can't take pride from? Because ultimately, that's the point. Right, because a person that has nothing more to offer than to make a statement like that, you can't help but it's because of pride. You can't help that there is something behind that wants to crush this deep, terrible injustice of calling, this medieval empire with a name rather than one other. Right, and completely overlooking the fact that for all the other policies, nobody gives a damn on a regular basis, right? That's the point that I do not accept, right? And to me, once again, if you are a person that has received at least the amount of education past the first year of a bachelor degree, it's fine for you to, at that age, to discover that, okay, that these were not Byzantines, never called themselves that way, it's all an invention, and all the things we will be saying in a while, but that, there is all that freaking history to make yet, and to study, and to realize that it was an enormous thing, an enormously complex stuff that, you could spend a life for which a lifetime is not of learning is not nearly enough to start to understand something about. That's just a question I pose, right? And as far as I'm concerned, you say Byzantine because it's dramatically much easier and clearer to understand. If you say stop someone, talk with a friend, say, yeah, do you like Roman history? I agree, there is something wrong in our culture at this point. Say, think about Roman history, you always think about, the early Roman Empire, fundamentally. Because for some reason, that's also what we have projected in there, that was distorted compared to the reasons. Because that's always about the reason that stands behind that. It's not about that you're passionate about it. You can be passionate whatever freaking thing you want, but not become a purist about it for no reason, because that's just a declaration of moral relativism, right? That for you, that thing is the most important thing ever, and all the others should bow because you know and others don't. There is no pride in that, because there is always someone that knows something more than you do. There's always something you have to learn from others. So stay humble. Don't make it a problem, a fuss, an enormous deal, right? Byzantine. Why Byzantine is acceptable in a way? Because we immediately understand what we're talking about. We understand more or less, for a person that has that manualistic knowledge, that we can start talking about a change that occurs somewhere arbitrarily between the 4th and 7th century, generally speaking, because also in here everybody can have his own opinion about, and that goes on till the mid 15th century, or a bit beyond for the relic states that after the fall of Constantinople, but that's fundamentally it, right? And at least you know what we're talking about. You know more without making, saying the medieval Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, you say Byzantine history, right? Byzantine Empire. That's it, right? You don't have, with the term Eastern Roman Empire, there is maybe, even in here, in the practicality of the name, like you immediately know what you're talking about as well. Okay, yeah, but if you're making the point that that's the actual name, know that was not at all the actual name, right? So if you don't care, fine, so use it. Use even Eastern Roman Empire, but possibly do not use it to disinform people about the fact that was the actually official name of the empire, because it was not. Right. So to me, Byzantine can't be used in that form, and it can be used in a broader and deeper semantic term. That is to say, as we were talking about before, for example, about art, about literature, right? There are all different fields. For example, in philological studies, there is properly, even here, in every university in the West, Byzantine philology, Byzantine literature, and we call it in this way, and it's not that the people who work in there are a bunch of bigots that say, ha ha ha, we know that, it's really Roman, but, we hide it because, dumb, ignorant people do not know it, right? And you come there like a hero, you pull out your sword and say, no, it was the Romans, right? And everybody, covers you in gold, and in prize you have all the women. You're like, no, it doesn't work like that. Right? It doesn't work like that. It's not real. Nobody cares. You just make a bad impression on the country. Just make an impression that that's where you stop, intellectually speaking. Not even intellectually, but just intellectually. Because the thing is, it's just that silly that, if you make the point for imposing that vision, you actually lose credibility, authority. I can't tell you by experience, not because I've ever done it, but simply because I've found people doing it, and for people that were aware of what the matters really are, historically and historiographically, that's breath poorly spent, right? So to me, you can use it. You can say the Byzantines. You can use it even with a positive exception, right? I personally, like the only ignorant people that I've met to use the term Byzantine in a derogatory fashion were journalists, for example. People who say, they use the term Byzantine in this kind of, conspirational, dark, morally ambiguous, all the stereotypes that existed in the West against Constantinople and the Roman Empire. Since the Middle Ages, right? So the term Byzantine is used to define this, even about the bureaucracy, for example. This Byzantine bureaucracy that is so overly sophisticated that it's dysfunctional, and eventually the thing crumbles anyway. Yeah, that's where I would kind of be happier to see it abandoned, because simply because I know that on average the person that uses the term doesn't have respect for history, right? Don't think that journalists are something as near as historians as they could be. They make a completely different job. there are some meeting points, but even the motivations and the goals and the rewards are on a completely different logic, and that's, for example, a field in which I don't feel myself, say it's bad to use the term Byzantine. For the rest, I try not to use it by default. I try to say, for example, another term that I detest is Byzantium, right? Even if that is something I wholly never use by habit. You say, well, you're fine with the Byzantine, but not with Byzantium. Yes, because Byzantium could be good to stress the importance of Constantinople proper as a city, because Byzantium is properly the city meant, and it's often used as a synecdoche for the whole empire, to say at Byzantium, right? Because it's entailed, because after all that was the city that took over the whole empire, and that were the emperors ruled from, and it was so loaded in political, religious, authorities, and you're at a character that you can equate at some point Constantinople with the empire. But at that point, by definition, Byzantium, which is, by the way, the Latin name of Byzantion, that is the proper Greek name of the former city after the Thraco-Hellenic center that the merchant Bosphorus, that eventually that's where Constantine founded Constantinople proper. So it's a bit too kind of classicist, right? And I don't like classicism a big deal either, right? And this is important for Byzantine history, because there are many people who buy into the literary elitism of the Byzantine court literature, and think that things like that, I don't know, that the classical Greeks were basically now the Romans, right? No, it didn't happen like that. And actually, if the classical Greeks had seen what would have happened there, they would not have been happy at all. I can tell you about that too. I've seen the worst kind of associations in a nationalistic sense from all sides, right? And but from this, maybe we shall stay a bit away. But just knowing that it happens, right? I use the term Byzantine in fact, to be more effective about it, right? It's about mostly space and time, mostly time distinction. For the rest, I don't use it very much. For the rest, if I have to say the Roman state, the Roman Empire, so I like to stress the continuity of the Romanity of the thing. You can go check in I've made a lot of videos on the Renovatio Imperii, for example, during the Middle Ages, and where I stand. Also on the legalistic question of the, how, can the Western Empire be considered Roman? And that's even a way more complex question that nobody really likes, and that's also what a reason that doesn't make me a great fan of the Constantinopolitan exclusivity about the imperial thing, because objectively it had driven much away from the imperial concept of the origins, and at that point we can't really tell that the first one was wrong and the latter one was right. That history is not about right and wrong, right? History is an inquiry, right? Then you judge whatever you like, but it remains an opinion, right? There is no certainty. There is no way to certify that, because there is no factual assessment that you can make about it. And if you feel the need to do it, it's because you have an agenda of some sort, right? You want to back that power because either you dislike others. There was naturally a backlash against the Western, contempt towards the Byzantines as well, right? And I can say that it still lives in a way today. Don't you think that, I've seen parallelisms drawn with that. I will not make direct examples, but, this idea that the Westerners, at the end of the day, they're just a bunch of barbarians after all. That is being bought by some, people who failed to collect the legacy of the Byzantine Empire, and that's utterly ridiculous, if not for, for the fact, the historical the ontology in itself. What did you use history to make political propaganda? That's not history. That's just you have no respect for history whatsoever. And the point of the legalistic point of the Romans, indeed, there was naturally all one with lots of other aspects, primarily religious, at that point, is cannot be fully. I don't buy it fully. Like, legally speaking, they were right, but in absolute terms, I think that what happened in the West deserves a shot, and especially the same Westerners, instead of just being obsessed with things like where to call Byzantine or Roman, should really look at their early, high, and even late medieval history and start to be a bit more, at least as equally interested in it, to say, okay, here there is a lot to look at that cannot be dismissed as, no, just because there is a legal thing here, the Pope and Charlemagne had no right to do whatever they did, so this whole thing is wrong, and they were bad, and they were false, and we should, they were animals and barbarians, we should just get rid of them, and they were just a bunch of, but you can't deal with history like that as well. But also, even if you don't make it this dramatic about this specific topic, also know that behind the Holy Roman Empire, at the very roots of, not just of the thing how it emerged just institutionally or politically, but from an anthropological or religious, cultural point of view, there is much more than just saying what from Constantinople they could rightfully say, that is to say, just an emperor can elect another emperor, appoint another emperor, actually. And this thing is invalid, right? Because if you had asked that to Romulus, he would have had a very different opinion of it. I'm saying Romulus, of course, as whoever he was, or at least whichever cultural background that the Romans at that in their archaic phase emerged from, they would have had a very different question, because the Byzantines were playing the card of the continuity, right? What happened what the Germans were doing was a wholly different thing. They were looking at the divine blessing of the arms, right? That from a strictly historical point of view is much closer to what brought to the origins of Rome from the very beginnings. I mean, than to what made the Roman Empire, Constantinople, remaining close to every other thing that was happening out there. And it's tough for an empire that at that point naturally thinks to be the depository of the universal power, etc., to realize that they're not a universal power anymore. Right? And it's obvious even in there, you can't blame them. You can't say, these were just, I've seen there is a lot of criticism against the Byzantines too. Right? In the West, we surely have that, but we have it also in other contexts, saying, the Byzantines were just, rotten, and immoral and backwards, and that they were just wrong about the whole thing. They were not true Romans anymore. They were just Greeks. They were just a fake copy of the Rome. That's not true either. That's wrong. That's stupid, right? And you can't say that, historically speaking, right? But if the terms of the discussion stop to this thing, you can easily understand that that's not a historical discussion. That's just modern nationalities or cultures trying to win their primacy for the reasons that we were talking about before, while the whole world is crumbling around them, and they're sinking with it, and they're doing nothing about but talking about this ideological idiocies, right? So that's where I would like to say there is many more intelligent things, but I say many more intelligent things, and just open like a modern study about Byzantine history that you can say, instead of pointing out these were not Byzantines but they were Romans, and making it a question of international, a diplomatic case, right? That's not a serious thing to do. It's not. It's nothing. It doesn't point out any consistent historical authority out of itself, right? If you want to prove you actually know something about this history, go more deeply into it. Start studying, pick the most updated historiography on that word. Start reading, start expanding, read articles, read what are the historical problems, start reading these sources. Learn, I don't know, medieval Greek, which is also modern Greek, I suppose. Read, Latin as well. Read even Arab. We did another disgusting thing I've seen happening, by the way, regarding to this, is that considering Constantinople like the shield of the West, as if there was no ever any intersection with any other people that was around, and that were fundamentally just this anti-Muslim thing, as if that, aside from the fact that most of the time the greatest threats to the empire came from the West, instead from, especially as time went on, and see what happened in 1204, by the way. But secondly, I've seen people bringing this hatred in a kind of conservative identitary sense, like Constantinople, the symbol of the West, of whichever was in the East was or under as Muslim was, is not even worth considering. How can you study Byzantine history, if you don't study Muslim history? That's a serious question. What are you confronting the empire to some of its major threats? Its constant, its policy in the Near East, in the Eastern Mediterranean, if you don't actually know what was from the other side, and if you don't actually acknowledge, as we have seen many times in Islamic history videos, that also those people who were, besieging Constantinople by the 7th century, the 8th century by sea, were actually former Byzantine Christians under Islamic rule, that were still Christians and attacking Constantinople. How can you objectivize history if you don't read even Islamic sources, if you don't realize even the enormous impact that the Byzantine, the Roman history, the Roman civilization, Byzantine, it is also more Hellenistic. Think about all the Hellenistic legacy of the Byzantine Empire. Right, how much was known in Constantinople that in West wasn't, and that came from something that wasn't properly Roman at all, because it came from the Hellenistic times, and of course, in part were also under Rome, but it also had stemmed from another culture, from other ideals, from other traditions, and the impact this had in Islamic civilization. The tales of Alexander reaching up to Far East Asia in the early Middle Ages, thanks to the Hellenistic libraries of Syria and Palestine and Egypt that fell in the hands of the Muslims, that didn't destroy them at all. Right, the myth that the Muslims destroyed libraries was put out expressly by the Muslims themselves to prove that they just read the Quran. But the actual thing they did is, as soon as they seized those cities, they immediately put their hands on these books and they treasured them. And we know that they circulated, that they studied them like crazy, because they knew the enormous cultural legacy that laid within that. And that's, if there was an Islamic civilization, we owe it largely to Hellenism, to the Roman Empire, to also to Persian culture and so on. But that's something you must acknowledge. What do you think there was east of so you don't even have to read or know about? What's the point of studying, as we were saying before, one country, pretending that that's only what matters and ignoring all the rest? There is no country in the world that exists by itself. If there is a country in the world, it's because there were other countries, other peoples out there. Otherwise, it does not exist by definition. It doesn't matter which country it is, right? Even here, it's not that the Muslims stole someone else's culture. That's another idiocy, right? And I can tell you as a conservative that I read this this stuff from people that are supposedly, by the way, because I think I'm very moderate in all of my positions, tendentially lean towards conservatism. This idea of cultural appropriation that now actually it's being paraded both by the left and by the right to actually prove their connaturated radical intellectual inferiority. But unfortunately, this is this is the point where I was making at the beginning of the video. If you give up to that garbage, you fail these civilizations here, the ones from which we come from, because those things were intelligent systems, right? You don't make an empire like the one of Constantinople surviving for 1,000 years, right? With that kind of idiocy, right? And there is a sad realization in this, that it's exactly when things began to go bad, and seriously bad, almost to a point of irreversibility, that's, that's where the crystallization of thought came. And the Byzantines had huge issues from a cultural point of view. This is another chapter that is actually very big and has a lot of importance in Byzantinistics, because it's a bit of a teleological red. In fact, it's been debunked and tends to be debunked, and I would like to read more about it. In fact, to observe how behind the face of the official culture of court, that was essentially the only thing we know about Constantinople, that in literary terms, most of the times at least. Of course, there are other works, but that's the picture we receive. There was a reality that had much more potential than it seemed. At least that there was a serious problem of political of vision, of mental flexibility in this regard, of cultural ultra conservatism that brought to important change, of course, for reasons, for interests that have nothing to do with ultra-conservatism itself, but just of normal interest in political balances within that system that, however, was short-sighted at the point to lose it to systems that might have not prevailed, right? There is nothing, for example, deterministic about the fall of the empire in up to very late. We have seen it with the Ottoman, during the 15th century, actually, how things could have been still reversed up to like 20 years before. And there is no Manzikert, Myriokephalon. If you ever studied those battles, or a bit of the strategic context of before and afterward, you know that even that drama of the terrible thing that blow everything up, it's nonsensical. Myriokephalon happened exactly because the Byzantines in 1 century had reversed, the situation after Manzikert. And Myriokephalon itself wasn't even, we don't even know what happened, historically speaking. Not just in the battle, but also afterwards, right? Everybody says it was a defeat. The Turks evacuating Iconium after Myriokephalon, because evidently, there was a Byzantine army running around, and we know that by fact, actually, and then you think that was like the most deterministic defeat, that, if Manzikert didn't kill it, Myriokephalon did it. But there's no evidence of this. There's no story. At this level of historiographical inquiry, we do not have any factual evidence of that. So, for example, if you buy into those things, please, I urge you to go out there and read books, read Magdalene, or read, there are a lot of scholars, mostly they're Anglo-Saxon. The interesting thing about this is also that the interest in Byzantine history at academic level restarted much from Anglo-Saxon. I think mostly probably from the UK at some level, because of certain local traditions. I don't know, that Cambridge, they think that they are basically the legacy, the collectors of Hellenic and Latin literature, all this kind of somewhat too self-referential attitudes. But they, since Byzantine history was mostly studied by these philologists, also B series, because it's seemingly in Hellenic literature, but there's much greater interest, of course, for the classical times, right? I talked with some of my professors of Byzantine history, that were specialized exactly, actually, in the allegedly darkest, truly darkest, in the sense there are the fewer sources ever. Like in the 7th century, it says, that the class called Hellenists, they pick on they mock the the Byzantinists, when they study Byzantine literature, because that's like not real Greek, it's medieval Greek, it's barbarian. You see how many prejudices there are at levels that can easily influence anyone, even the greatest experts. So you once again, you think that the enormous deal here is about calling Roman or Byzantine. I think we can't go past beyond a bit far, past beyond it. There would be a lot of things that I would like to tell, but let's get this video down actually. So if we were to give a definition to conventional one, well, at least the one I could have, I don't know, I studied it, 10 years ago, a bit less. So Byzantine history, as we mean it, concerns substantially the events of this eastern part of the Roman Empire, for when naturally, the West still was included in the account, that in fact survived for a millennium to the fall of the West, and the capital of which was Constantinople, or other people say Byzantium. Now, first of all, a point about this, that the main stereotype of the Byzantines is their decadence, right? Historiographically speaking, that's what the mostly in the Enlightenment historiography, like this, because they were against anything religious, right? Anything Ancien Regime, and in many ways the Roman Empire embodied the greatest thing that had ever happened in the Ancien Regime. And they picked on they mocked the empire, but let's say in the Middle Ages, because of course of the lesser power that it had compared to before. While today we have a completely different view of the thing. And as a matter of fact, what is impressive about the Roman Empire in this period is how many blows it was capable of taking from these avalanches of peoples that fell on it, against it, to try to, to tear down, to take down the big animal and devouring its corpse. And how resilient the empire was, how many blows it took, and it was able to stand again on its feet. And it took massive blows, right? We are making lots of videos on Byzantine history. There is no reason now to explain how and why this happened, but it's obvious that it has to do with an efficient political and social system, right? That's, in military terms, in many ways, that's the cause of all outcomes. It's what stands behind people who fight also in this regard, what system brought them there to fight. And this resilience is really extraordinary, because objectively, even on the myth of the decadence, how to read this? Well, the concept of decadence, as we have just pointed out, a decadence that lasts 1,000 years is a bit of a joke. Like, what kind of decadence is this, right? If something decays, it's because it's going, to be over soon, in a way or another. If we really want to find a spark of light in this interpretation, we can definitely see that the empire tended to, it had this main, re-expansions. If you think about the Macedonian or the Komnenian period, that were intertwined with this moment of crisis, mostly internal crisis, but naturally also external attacks and so on. So there is this back and forth that definitely demolishes the most conventional idea of decadence. But there is, in fact, if you look at in a broader sense, in a broader perspective, there was a world out there that was changing, right? And it's very difficult to measure, historically speaking, the power of a medieval polity, right? On paper, you can make that exercise, but eventually it doesn't make sense. It's not like a living organism. It's not something you can measure scientifically. It really depends on this approximation we constantly do through history and all the possible details we can draw from it. And in general, there is the impression that at a certain point, the Byzantine Empire was outclassed by other powers, and chiefly the Western ones, right? This is not about, getting destroyed in open field, for example, by, like at Manzikert or Mirokevelen, respectively, by, the Seljuk Turks that would basically fragment, in spite of namely the nominal extension of their power over the Middle East and so on, but that eventually crumbled as well. What is left of the Seljuk Empire, and the same goes for the Sultanate of Iconium, right? Another thing is when you have essentially you start depending as a theoretically universal empire on foreign manpower of sort. Think about the Frankish mercenaries or the Italian merchants, or generally speaking, this broader Western culture that is rising fast, and I mean pretty damn fast, right? In my calculations, like the West, the Latin Germanic West, had this very slow, very gradual, at least, growth from the early medieval, the high medieval times, that blossoms all quite speedily for those time standards, actually, in those last few centuries, in the High Middle Ages, and fundamentally by the 12th century, they reached the Byzantine Empire at all levels. By the 13th century, they have basically surpassed. Right, this is my historical judgment about it, and I've studied, I can say, extensively both systems at some point. I'm more into, Latin Germanic history, but I've studied especially some the reign of Emmanuel I Comnenus. That's an extraordinarily fascinating emperor, and it's under that reign that there is properly the key of all the problem in many ways, or if not of all of it, of course, but if a moment that showed how the Byzantine Empire could still, grow, it could still change, could still start restructuring itself from different bases, and it didn't. Or at least it did, but the thing stopped there after the death of Emmanuel. There is a prejudice against this. There are many people out there that I criticized a lot, and I've made a lot of videos about this, about the scientifical advancements of the West compared to ones of the East, the Renaissance, all this stuff. There are lots of people out there that are very, pro-Byzantine for ideological sense, that basically believe still, which is something that Byzantinistic studies have debunked since a very long time, and those are the Byzantine studies, not the Western, pro-Western studies, that basically the European Renaissance occurred because of the Byzantine refugees that brought all the classical books from Constantinople to the West, and that's the Italian Renaissance started from. It's utter nonsense, right? That helped surely the Renaissance, but the only reason the Renaissance happens is because the West had already created a society that was way more dynamic, literally rich, advanced, technologically advanced already than the Byzantine one. Right, there is no comparison. If you look at 15th century Byzantine Empire in terms of economical potential, agricultural production, generally speaking, of innovation, application, the West was far ahead. But I mean far ahead already by itself. And the only reason why those books could be read and studied and put to fruit was exactly that. The West was already perfectly capable of what were already the same level of that intellectual development. And that happened 200 years before, even more. It happened by the 12th century. By the 12th century, there is no doubt about this. The West is already more dynamic, again, richer, more educated. Maybe the agricultural production threw in, but that's maybe debatable. Let's leave it aside because it's not the word dramatic differences in that regard. But socially speaking, economically speaking, there is no comparison. And there are specific reasons, by the way, why it was the case, right? Probably there were some cultural, um, barriers in Constantinople to breaking through a greater degree of enterprising business. There were naturally, the Westerners dominated the markets at that point, right? There wasn't even properly a Byzantine fleet to oppose to gain the upper hand in Mediterranean anymore. They were all Italians at that point. And the thing, there is no, we don't exclude here naturally that the contact between the West and the East of Europe was beneficial, right? That the Byzantines didn't play any part, right? The Byzantines were part of the Western world, broadly meant. It's just that whatever happened in the Latin Germanic West that we're trying to explain through countless videos is something that the empire didn't witness, right? There weren't the political, social premises for making it. You can see interpreting reality, for example, in centers like Thessalonica, that was at some point by the 12th century, basically the single city, except Constantinople, that deserves this name in the empire, right? Truly a true, polity on its own that in fact tried to sneak away, to decentralize, to autonomize itself from Constantinople, right? That hadn't managed to choke it, right? As instead happened with all the other territories or the other centers, right? And in there you see something that resembles more like an Italian maritime republic or something of that kind, but by a much smaller degree. And you don't find anything else like that. You find Monemvasia, but like a minor center after all, that didn't develop into anything more significant, and you find a sheer structural difference between East and West. So by the 12th century, there is really the turning point in many ways, at least in terms of this balance, of this capability overall. And it's not easy, right? It's not easy to be the Byzantine Empire. It's not easy to be always, with this enemies that surround you from every side. That takes away a lot of resources. Everything is justifiable. Like, this system wasn't doomed, as we were saying before, but definitely the thing waited a lot for its further development, and it must be taken into account at many, many levels. No, by the 15th century, by the thresholds of Renaissance, Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire could teach a very few to the West. Right, a very few. And there's no surprise, it was a major, also economical, technological penetration, like, take a typical Byzantine army of the 15th century, that's all Western weapons and crafts, and, think about the artillery, it was over. Like, the time of the development of the thing was over. Like, even the countrysides were completely different, right? There is no comparison between the dynamism of Western Europe compared to the Eastern one at that time, including the Byzantine Empire. It was not the vitality, it was not the net, that productivity, those dynamic autonomous centers were competing all with each other, sectorializing their resource. No, this was still a latifundium, basically, as such, and it wasn't, as you know, that wasn't the future on the long run, and already by that time was had lost the potential at the time, right? Well, by the 12th century, the empire was already an enormous much. By 1204, with the fall, actually the Paleologi were quite good at retaking control, and in some generations, and to restart a bit in the early 14th century, the growth of the let's say by the end of the 13th, this growth of the empire. But the thing was cut short once again by internal struggles, etc. But theoretically, the empire could have at that point expanded once again. These problems prevented it, but it was possible, even in there, on very different bases, because the whole statal structure had jumped, right? There was no way to represent it as it had been before, right? It was choked. Too many territories had been lost. Was simply no resources to carry that out. But gradually, they could have turned into something more consistent. Had simply different. After all, even small events gone differently in the bigger picture. So as we were saying before, Byzantium is or better, Byzantion was the originary denomination of today's Istanbul, right? That, as we've seen, and these are all things you know, that by the 4th century was known as Constantinople, the city of Constantine, in honor of the Emperor Constantine I. And therefore, Byzantium and Constantinopolis, right, are the Hellenic toponyms of the city, right, that are used indifferently already at the time, however, in the medieval sources, while Istanbul is, as you know, is the Turkish name, was enforced actually very recent in time, and it derived from the deformation of the Hellenic words Istin Polin, right, that means in the city, right, and it was allegedly, at least not sure about the story, but it's because, allegedly the Turkish guards, the Ottoman guards said, where are you going? He said, I'm going to in the city. And so it became Istanbul, right? But that's just a deformation. And the subjects of what are called the Byzantine Empire, that is the Roman Empire, as we've said, are commonly defined as Byzantines. But in the more recent historiography, we also start finding against more the definition of the Romans, or even derivations of the term Romaioi, which the Hellenic type, right? So it's either Romani or Romaioi, right? So it's either the Latin or the Hellenic version of the name. And we like in Byzantinistics, Romans is used, generally speaking, for the more ancient time of Byzantine, of the so-called Byzantine history, from the 4th to the 7th century. Then eventually, that's the moment in which the Romaioi, technically, there are certain languages. For example, in Italian, there is the term Romei, which comes from Romaioi, and technically speaking, that's how it's preferred in that country to exactly stress instead of using Byzantine, right? But in generally speaking, the term Byzantine starts, in fact, from this contraction we've made a lot of videos on at this point of the 7th century, that brings the empire to enclose itself on this interior provinces that were mostly Hellenic in culture because of the Islamic invasions and all and this allowed a compaction of its culture in a less ecumenic sense, and hence it's from these transformations that we start mostly drawing the difference between Byzantine. And I must say that Gibbon's historiographer, for example, started with Constantine to call the Byzantines Byzantines, right? Today, at least in the historiographical praxis, I've seen that it's mostly from the 7th century, or at least if it depends on the work. Like, the work begins already by the 5th, especially the 6th, the 7th, times of Justinian, especially they already start talking about Byzantines, right? A discriminant is, in this sense, the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire, and the usage of the term Byzantines in reference to the inhabitants of the Roman Empire is of modern origin, right? And does not find any evidence in the sources, if not to address the citizens of the capital. So that's how it originated, but it was a minoritary term that eventually was extended in the Renaissance to the whole thing, the whole system. And the Byzantines, as we have by this point quite clarified, saw themselves as Romans, right? And this is not a matter of the elite, of the hierarchies. No, they were properly so, right? And here we often make it a question of pride, right? We often associate the fact, that we are Romans. That what do you know actually what a Byzantine peasant thought of himself like? We don't even know it for the West, right? It's obvious that the Roman thing was very important for the ruling class, for the international prestige of the empire, and from naturally many aspects of its political and social organization were based on previous systems that had, in fact, defined, even identitarily, the same empire in that regard, in a Roman sense. And the Romans, so what I point out here is not that the Byzantine peasant wouldn't call himself a Roman. He would. But the point is that for him, as a peasant, that was not a big deal, right? That person just wanted to survive between famines and raids, and if he had been called Roman or whatever, he would have probably given much of a damn. And actually, we have seen in a lot of circumstances in Byzantine history how there were, Byzantine subjects were more than happy actually to join the enemy side. This happened in many occasions, as it would happen in any other polity, right? And therefore, this is just for breaking the aura of hierarchical prestige that surrounds the thing, right? What is to be a Roman here? That since the 3rd century, the 4th century, Roman citizens had turned fundamentally into Roman subjects. So, yeah, Roman, my eyes, right? As long as you had a role, a career, maybe in a public office, and you had broader horizons, you could, acknowledge the fact you were part of the Roman Empire, but don't think that a medieval peasant actually give much of a damn to which system it belonged, because his life was equal to the one of anybody else, and actually the things weren't that better in the Byzantine world than in other systems in that regard, compared to especially the sedentary populations, like between the Franks or the Arabs. Things were somewhat similar after all, with all the differences that naturally existed. And they naturally adapted the same term to the world in which they lived, the Romania, right? Rhomania, right? So the land of the Romans, technically, that was conceived in counterposition to the one of the barbarians that were not part of it, right? The term Romania, I knew it actually appeared in 4th century. Some of you said me there is also in the 3rd. Excuse me, drink a little. But even here, it's not a big deal. Naturally, it's mostly an Hellenic derived one, as far as I understand, and it's of popular origin. So that it's actually very historically poignant, because it shows really the boundless idea of an ecumenic empire. Like, Romania was like even a state of being, in a sense. Like, it wasn't even just a place, right? An ecumenic empire is, by definition, an ecumenic empire, so there is no limit, there is no border, right? But naturally, with the contraction also of the Roman territory, the settlements of the Germanic populations, other phenomena, this idea of the land of the Romans and the land of someone else had become to be more stressed, and naturally this maintained a character, right? Of course, the frontiers this time, throughout all the Middle Ages, eventually remained pretty blurred, actually. It wasn't properly a border, right, of sort, and the same empire was open and even overlapping with many different realities that probably didn't even feel or come to be part of that, right? Think about the Slavs or the Bulgars, and we will see how even other areas of formerly inhabited by the Roman Empire and by the Romans were kept being seen in a sort of continuity with that Roman legacy, right? By the 5th century, the term Romania enters in current use, and up to the 15th century, we talk, in fact, of Romania with in reference to the Empire of Constantinople proper, right? The centrality of Constantinople is very important because, as you know, the Roman Empire, exactly as the same example of Constantinople and its foundation reveal, had Rome always remained technically the capital of the empire up to a certain point. The idea was lost somewhere, like in the early Middle Ages, but the idea is naturally Rome was, for religious reason, given that it was properly a Christian and exclusively Christian empire, that Rome was truly the center of the empire. But fiction or aside, of course, this was a Constantinopolitan empire. There is nothing to do about that. As we were saying before, Constantinople literally swallowed any other community nowhere in another that inhabited the empire. It was difficult, right? It was all a transition that, as you think about the teams that for example, had a greater development in certain regions over others that were more or less difficult to control. Like there is an effort of territorialization that starts expressive from Constantinople. There are certain communities of the empire that actually want to slip out of it, right? And also the iconoclasm and other movements, other realities. Even there is not even just properly an extensional problem here of physical distance from the capital. Think about Thrace, that is, the country northwest of Constantinople itself. During the Slavic invasions or the arrival of the Bulgarians, at some point, it was a foreign land, and it wasn't just much about the domination itself, the namely domination. It was properly about a lifestyle, right? The late antique substratum that had formed the backbone of the empire with this essentially Mediterranean cities, it was very different from the interland dimension that instead was somewhat superficially Romanized. Think about the Slavs that basically penetrate everywhere and up to Peloponnese and even beyond. They take the sea at some point. Some went probably up to North Africa, this regard. But these were populations that eventually would be absorbed by the Roman Empire. So centuries afterwards, you would find those areas like, we are Romans, right? Yeah, but at the beginning they were Slavs. They were not even Christians. And yet they lived within the empire, and the empire had to cope with that. And what's the empire anyway, right? As much as you can claim or as much as you can hope to reconquer, right? That's a situation that is continuously evolving. Territorially speaking, it's very difficult to draw a boundary here. And as we were saying before, don't think that all the subjects were kind of, xenophobically hysterical about just saying, okay, we are the Romans inside and all the outsiders are bad. Like many subjects were actually, fine about saying, oh, finally, someone invading the place. So here I can start running my own business like the mob, that is basically the standard system of any other non-statal communitary organization since the nation state in history, and enjoy this decentralized position to do whatever they like. Think about the great monasteries of southern Italy. Think about, as we've seen, the Balkans very closely, but even certain other areas. Think about the later Byzantine times, where there are the cities like Trebizond, or even this other kind of ramp states. Think about the Piraeus, etc. They kind of almost tended to go their own way. Like namely, when Constantinople fell, they said, okay, we are the true Byzantines. Yeah, because now that it was convenient for them to claim that legacy, but it's not that they gave actually a damn about it up to the previous point, if not for just, in fact, political reasons, as always, right? And this has nothing to do with the fact that they were actually Byzantine in many ways, aside from their regional influences. But there is no discrepancy between doing the thing for just political practicality, but in private life just being an Orthodox Christian, to speak Greek, to like Byzantine culture and customs and literature and all this. So that's normal in many ways. We're skipping a lot now because this is just like theoretically about the term of Byzantine, but it's there would be a lot to tell, way a lot to tell. Like a single video is never gonna be enough about so many other factors. How there was probably a moment of construction of what we could call as the essential, the Byzantine education, for example. It stemmed from the meritocratic administrative system and public career, even Senate at the time of Justinian. And even at the time of Constantine, that actually began in embryo, but eventually was reinforced. So actually, for example, by the time of Justinian, we're talking about it a few days ago, like there were, like, for example, the Romano-Italic Senate that, in Rome, that maybe, had something to say about what is Roman, that loathed what was happening in Constantinople. All these new senators were coming out through this system that, they saw them as newcomers, as, commoners, or people that were absolutely had nothing to share with this extremely ancient patrician families of Italic origin, and that, in fact, and telling the truth, this aristocrats in Italy were dramatically more educated and probably way more cultured than the senators in Constantinople. So there is, even in here, what is that we're talking about, even in terms of where did the West end? Like, there is this historiographical perspective that says, basically the West died at some point, all darkness and shit. First of all, that never occurred like that, but there is an element that is often overlooked, that is, in the West, the Roman legacy survived in some way, like, not in the imperial sense from a legalistic point of view, but I mean, the idea that after all the Latin element, the Germanic element eventually created something on their own that had been part of those lands from a certain time onwards, and had been part of the empire in a way or another, had its own meaning. Like the papacy had its own importance. The Roman communities of Italy, of Gaul, of Spain were actually very important in this regard. The Romano-Germanic kingdoms, fundamentally the Germanic elite, were Romanized. Right, the Germans began, they diluted into the Romanic population. They started speaking Latin, or however Romance languages. There was a moment in which that Romanity, that Latinity, was interiorized in a way or another, and it was coming back. I mean, don't think that the Crusaders in 1204, while they were sacking Constantinople, they weren't seeing in their own view that there was something Roman from their own side at the same point. Of course, they didn't give a damn, right? Especially the feudal element was, very... Now, we shouldn't digress on this things, but there was definitely a reality for which even the Holy Roman Empire corresponded there to an authority that couldn't be, like, you could escape from that, you could not be under it, but you still were fundamentally referencing to. And the same goes for the same Roman Empire itself, right? So it's not that the fall of the West contemplated that those... the Germans took over, those greedy barbarians taking our lands of the Romans, and then, the Roman civilization fell, and everybody cried, and everybody was dissatisfied, and the Justinian sent Belisarius, and everybody was happy that the Romans had come back. Not at all, right? I can tell you that for sure. If you look at the Gothic War, for example, the inhabitants of Italy were much better off without the Byzantines, for that matter, considering what happened. But also what happened even later to the war, when, as we'll see now, in fact, lots of people fled to Longobarд territory because they didn't want to pay taxes to the Byzantines that at that time were truly becoming something foreign, right? Let's be honest about this. They spoke other languages. They came from other places. They were another world. We're starting to be another world. I know that you can't trace here the difference, that it's controversial, that, there is this narrative for which, everything was blended there and nobody cared about identities. But this is really, I think, a very controversial ideal in itself. Actually, we have plenty of historical evidence that people were pretty tied to their, if not to their identity in an inflexible sense, but at least to the fact that a place that like someone comes from another community is someone coming from another community, right? And there are differences in this regard. The elites naturally were more open tendentially, or at least they had more interests on a broader scale. But you don't think that the average peasant out there actually was happy to see that someone else had come to impose the taxes instead of someone else, and at that point it was about just choosing the side that that they had it easier with, right? So even ideologically speaking, you have to acknowledge that there is a deep attrition, and that there is not just the good guys that went on as the Romans, and the bad guys that were the barbarians that ruined everything, right? Everybody. I had I had my time in which I studied early medieval history in Western Europe, and I must say that the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, in many cases, were a truly amazing thing, right? That the whole judgments that we have about, I don't know, the Longobards, for example, they are motivated all from Papal Byzantine historiography. They, the local history of the places tells us a wholly different story that is often overlooked. But how many people care about the Longobards, and how many care about the Byzantines, and especially how many of those who care about the Byzantines still buy the thing that now has been, completely overthrown by historiography since 2 generations, that the Longobards were just a bunch of bloodthirsty barbarians that destroyed everything and destroyed Italy, and made the thing fall into the darkness of the Middle Ages. I bet a lot. And these people simply have not even opened a book in the last 50 or 70 years about early medieval historiography. So that's where I'm concerned about the resurgence of certain sympathies towards certain realities, when these are not coupled with a broader historical awareness. Because sadly and bitterly enough, what you discover is behind that there is just a lot of prejudice, of fanboyism, of and of reasons that properly are not tied to a whole an objective vision or an effort to make it objective, right? There is a more hideous side of the story, because I can understand a person that is born in one place and naturally likes or tends to have more sympathy towards the things that happen in that country rather than another, right? It's normal, right? Even if you're open to the idea that you have to learn about other countries, it's normal that you tendentially prefer your own. But first of all, it's not always true. But more importantly, and more this would be an interesting object even for a thesis or master thesis or even a PhD of history of historiography, to see in this regard how much of the renewed interest in Byzantine history over literally everything else you could pick in the enormous historical pool around it is connected to a kind of ideological vision, for example, of the continuity in the essential positivity and superiority and progress and modernity and Western identitarism that we had attached to the early Roman Empire, for example, right? The idea that it's very easy to make, that came from, especially from this secularized mindset that is, Rome was kind of a modern secular state, that it was similar to ours, that actually was not by definition, because Rome, as much as Constantinople, were exclusively founded on a religious military principles. And I say exclusively, meaning that aside from that there was nothing proper, right? The Byzantines, as we were saying before, added a bit more of institutional and juridical awareness about themselves in a regulatory fashion, but that was also used as a tool in international pool. But this still enlightening and positivistic attitude towards the idea that it was like the greatest empire and that all the rest were backward barbarians, right? and that we discovered that the Byzantines weren't bad, so just let's continue the greatness of the Roman Empire over anything else that ever existed into the Byzantines, and let's exclude, I don't know, the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, the Holy Roman Empire, all the feudal kingdoms, because those are bad, right? Let's just be fan about the Byzantines because that's it, right? I have seen it that as well. And that's always the question you should pose yourself. If you like so much the Byzantines, you should say, okay, they're very fascinating, they're beautiful, I agree with you. I love them myself. I've read a lot of books about them. I always chosen all the possible Byzantine classes I could at university. So I realized this video is pretty heavy from the other side of the eye. Like, I'm trying to not to put the Byzantines in a bad light, but just to make a historical assessment about the picture, the broader picture. And secondly, what, for everything you know about Byzantine history, what do you know about, let's say, Western European history of that same time? You see, because if you study the Roman Empire, more or less, that was the only thing that existed, at least in a broader Western horizon. Then, of course, there were the Chinese, there were other powers and so on. It's not that they're not important, but, the Roman Empire is pretty much it. All we know about those, like, 20 other peoples who were around it, we know it thanks to the Greeks or to the same Romans. They are the same ones telling about the story, so you can't totalize your attention in a way towards the Romans, right? And it's also ridiculous from one other historiographical perspectives to say, but we should study more about the Celts because the Celts were equally important. No, they weren't equally important. Objectively, they were not equally important, and also we have dramatically less to study about them. So that really justifies why we study the Romans and why we don't need to attach to it in any identitary fashion like it's often done with this kind of Neo-Celtic stuff or Neo-Germanic. But the same goes, it shouldn't happen for the Neo-Romans, right? There are a lot of people who are utterly obsessed about Rome, like they shouldn't be about anything in life for a healthy psychological condition, and that project on it literally the best thing that ever happened, all the greatest progress, the greatest identity. The fact, we were those people. Yes, because, you think that you were kind of like you are. How does it happen? Were you born 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago? How does it really work? How does it really work? Your idea of a descendant of genetic construction of cultural, influences. Do you think you are that you come, like without any exception from that, and that what you should make your life of, that is, a political social system of 1,000 years ago, like projecting it to now? Like, how does it work? I've seen all this stuff. If you have never, I know I'm polemical, but if you've never maybe gotten interested in this stuff, it's plenty of people reason like that. Just go under any YouTube video of some following about Byzantine history and look at what the average comments are. And then you will believe me at that point. And you know what, I'm upset because I realize maybe YouTube comments are not the best pool of of samples you can imagine, but still those are people, those are real people, and believe me, they're not just like internet memes that say, are you 12 years old? No, those are people of 30, of 50, of even more. Like they're serious. Allegedly serious, mature individuals that express those thoughts, right? And that's the problem we're talking about. Because if you reason like that, there is no chance you're gonna make it in understanding the world you actually live in. Because first of all, that's enormously more complicated than the Byzantine one, if you actually understood what that was. And if that's how you interpret the system, there's no chance you have to try to interpret the current one. And then you click on these profiles and you read what channels they are. They're all identity stuff. They're all kind of either certain side of the aisle, the political aisle, either ultra-conservatism or other stuff. And that's bad, because if that's what conservatism is going to, we're done for. right? And that's a serious problem. We need to counterbalance political views at all times for having a healthy political and social reality to live in. And if that's what you see mostly represented in such a large size as these, that's a big problem we have. It's not that we didn't have it in the past, but that also explains why the past sometimes really sucked that bad up to a very recent time. So let's hope for an improvement, but also let's be aware that something has to be done actively to debunk this stuff. Relatively to the definition of Romans, the term was not just, paraded by the Byzantines themselves, right? All the foreigners indicated Romania, the territories governed by the empire. Think about, for example, in northern Italy, that there are the regions of Romagna and of Lombardy, right? That take their name from the ancient dominion of the Romans around Ravenna, and the one contraposed to it of the Longobards, or also the toponym Romania, with which the Crusaders called the empire, right? The Crusaders, that was the land of the Romans, no doubt about it. The term ar-Rum, used by the Arabs and the other Muslim peoples in order to indicate the subjects of Constantinople, or also by the Sultanate of Rome, that the Turks established in Asia Minor, occupying the territories that had already belonged to the empire, right? Relatively to the Sultanate of Rome, just to make you understand the point. I don't remember actually in Arab and in Turk, because it was used in the same time, or even in Persian, what the Sultanate of Rome was called like, right? And people could tell you at that point, if you it's the same for the Byzantines, right? If you want to call the right name, you should find out what the Sultanate of Rome really was called, because probably wasn't called exactly this way. There were other definitions for it, and how many people really do know about that, right? And the typical question I expect is, nobody cares about the Sultanate of Rome because, we don't like it. Yes, because instead you like maybe the Byzantine Empire because you think that it was cooler and that the Turks were the evil guys and that you were the good ones, and all this stuff, that's not how it works, right? That's not history. That's like, pick a football team and go watch a game, right? That's the same level of historical judgment, right? And I find a guy recently who was on Facebook some month ago that struck me, because this guy was obsessed with the Normans. I like the Normans as well. I wouldn't like to make you think that all the things I'm criticizing here is because I don't like. I like everything. I like the Romans. I like the Byzantines, whatever you want to call them. I like the, I like the Crusaders. I like the Turks. I like everything, because historically that's what I like, right? And that's what history is beautiful for. And this guy was, and I like the Normans, definitely, I do. Even if I haven't made much video on them, but I promise it's totally random, and we'll have to compensate for that. This guy basically was, once again, the ultra-identity idiot that was dressed and, shaped like a Viking. He wanted to be a Norman, all this stuff. He's sickly. He was even kind of, not very well. He wanted to be a tough guy, and so it didn't really look like much of a match in combat, if you really want to. But even mocking. I like the psychology of people, because I presumed that there is someone maybe that, I don't know, maybe it's being mocked because of his height or his constitution, and then needs to over radicalized ideologically about a random people that he sees as the picture of its own ethnical purity. All that we are borderline like that. And basically, I shared this video. It was about Byzantine history. It was about the battle of, I don't know, it was Palaeologi victory over the Sultanate of Rome, in fact. And I posted this video saying, the description said, here we talk about battle of, I missed the name, but you find it in the battle playlist and Byzantine playlist. And between the Empire of Nicaea, the Byzantines and the Palaeologi, and the Sultanate of Rome. Now, this guy basically criticized me because, according to him, I had mixed That is what all the Western historiography does, right? Including the Byzantinistics. An Arab / Persian name, Rum, right? In the English name Sultanate of Rum, right? It should have been Sultanate of Rome, and he was subtle and pathetic in this regard, because you see the misery of these people, see how it happens. Like he said, what's the Sultanate of Rome? He started like that, and my question is, either this is a moron like that has never heard about it, and that is in a Byzantine history group, and that talks about the Normans and the Byzantines, and doesn't even know about the Sultanate of Rome. Like either he's kind of a completely brainless, or there is something strange about it. So to be a bit provocatory, but also after all informative, I simply posted the Wikipedia article about the Sultanate of Rome. And there he began the bullshit, because he started saying, but the Sultanate, you mixed an Arab name with an English one, blah, 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 all this stuff. Of course, I didn't answer, nobody actually sympathized with him, because it was utterly ridiculous, right? And I said something, I don't remember actually, but, I also obviously pointed out to Wikipedia is a cancer or something like that, because I don't know, because he feels inferior to the levels of development that Wikipedia represents compared to him, and that's instead, the fact that we talk about the Sultanate of Rome as historiographical definition is a very good example that I brought up now, because in my opinion expresses beautifully how a name that doesn't quite exist, because there was nothing like, I presume, literally a Sultanate of Rome, and even the expression is mixing, objectively a non-English name. Like we say Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, there's nothing Greek about that. There is nothing, about the Basileiaton Romaeon or anything, right? The Sultanate of Rome expresses beautifully how deeply, actually it's an enormous compliment to the Roman Empire to call something the Sultanate of Rome, because it expresses how deeply the same Turks that invaded the lands of the empire had interiorized that was Rome. Do you understand how deep that is? I mean, you struggle against this empire, but you're actually mesmerized by it. This is true. If you look at the early Islamic invasions, the early Islamic historiography was very positive, very well, very respectful towards Heraclius. He was considered as a great ruler, and the reason being that these peoples, technically, they were shortly they weren't, they were converted to Islam, but they were kind of new to the faith, but they were acquainted from Central Asia to this Middle Eastern, Near Eastern dimension, and they still recognized automatically, and this is what we based all the Renovatio Imperi videos on as an ideological explanation, on the fact that that was not like an empire like the others, right? That was the Empire of Rome. That was a universal empire, and that these Turks that were coming, that, by the way, after Manzikert especially, they weren't much of, they were Seljuks nominally, but, all the people that poured again together with them, sometimes they were even Kurds, there were Armenian, people literally coming from everywhere. We made a video about this, by the way, about especially the same Byzantines and Franks that were serving in the Turkish armies of Iconium. And we will keep making videos about those. There were people as far as, Russians, there were other people of Central Asia, people from every freaking where that saw the empire they were fighting against as the universal empire. I mean, the sheer magnitude of this power, so that you don't conquer this place and you rename it as Turkey. No, you conquer it, you call it the Sultanate of Rome, to point out that thing, you had basically entered in that system yourself. You were not really a satellite in that regard, but, something that still could fit in the thing, and it was an enormous prestige. So this is an example, aside from the the Norman fanboy imbecile that were writing that stuff, that in my opinion, like it's a wrong name historiographically, but it's very powerful because it stresses how much Romanity had been interiorized by the same enemies of the Romans that were using it in a not in a derogatory sense, right? Probably this is extremely important. I would like to make you understand the sheer um, depth of the thing. Aside from the fact that naturally criticism such as the one we said about these names, etc., sounds very much like much of these medieval events seem to be interpreted in a popular way, just like a counterposition of nations. Like, of course, there is Turkish nationalism that thinks, I don't know, the Seljuk Turks were like an actual nation, that everything stamps, everything is Turkish. I mean, you find it in the area a lot of they have a lot of Turkish followers. They're perfectly aware of what I'm talking about, even if they don't marrying to that, let's say. But and equally, certain things think about that the Byzantines were an actual nation, or that were nations as the first thing that mattered there. Actually, the first thing that mattered that was the political and military power. In there, you could have an origin, you could have an ethnic background, a culture, whatever everybody has. But the thing that really mattered is how mostly your clan, mostly your that was the background that counted, especially in tribal society, could rise to the power of God, right? The power of the skies, whichever it was, like, because it could be pagan or monotheistic. It was actually the same thing. It was so for the Romans, for the Germans, for the Turks, like everything was revolving around that. It was about the great power on earth that truly mattered, was connected with the skies, with the deity. So even in here, to make it a question of even talking about, I mean, everybody knows that these are synecdoches. Do you think that the Normans, I don't know, that invaded England or Sicily were actual Normans? Like, there were people that were, they were a synecdoche. There were people coming, they were essentially Western Frankish people, there were Flemish, there were Britons, but there were people collected from Germany, from Italy, from everywhere. These groups were mostly called in ways that we don't even know clearly the origins of. Like, there is all the problem of the ethnonyms or just of the names of the synecdoche that started to be used. And if you enter in that mindset, you realize how deep and strong the bond with this major universal power or powers or still was at the time. And how there wasn't this obsession for defining an identity of all cost and trying to lecture people about how you should call the people, because what matters for those people is not the amount of power they had, like the greatness, the accomplishment. That's why the renovatio imperii is actually a very serious thing, that it cannot be dismissed in a legalistic sense, because whatever happened, that Charlemagne ruled over half of Europe with sword in hand. And that thing, since the times of the shamans, the semi-nomadic world, was all what mattered in the mystics of rule. It was collected by his empire. And naturally, the Byzantine Empire was an enormous thing, right? Even if it, at that point, wasn't an ecumenic power anymore. So here we're not making probably a ranking of which the strongest, was the coolest, and then side with that. We have to realize the inherent logic of systems that were, by the way, radically unstable, like Constantinople being an exception because of this extraordinary legacy of theirs that was probably a saddle one, right? And that was taken by the same Arabs. Think about the Caliph, the Abbasids. Think about the Umayyads, etc. But that's also, on the long run, was worn out by systems that were very different, like feudalism, for example, from the other side. And this must be understood as well. Now, passing to other labels or attributed, for example, even in a derogatory sense. Let's talk about the definition of Greeks or Hellenes, right? This is interesting because there's also a bit of a kind of Hellenic nationalism in here in the thing. Well, just know that in Constantinople, to be called a Greek or a Hellen was an insult. Okay, because Hellenism was considered as a synonym of paganism, and consequently, Hellen corresponded to an idolater, right? Implying a connection with the pagan cults that had been banished in Christian Constantinople. Right, so even the Hellenic legacy of the Byzantine Empire that is evident and is powerful, right? But it doesn't justify any ethnic national connection in that regard, right? Aside from the fact that these are areas of Europe that underwent dramatic ethnic changes on the long run, that were already, historically quite mixed, right? Different from other areas of Europe that are often credited as having been invested by major, invasions and having changed. Actually, doesn't seem like that. The empire, as we've seen, was mostly a coastal empire, an empire of cities. Some of the most dynamic places that shared an ethnic background, but in a cultural sense, but not much in in terms of where you came from. Right, most of this, if you look at dynasties that emerged in the empire, they weren't even properly, Greek, as we could call them, and nobody cared, because the deal of the universal empire is exactly that it's not connected to a nationality. Being Roman in that sense is not, being, properly, like being forced to speak just one thing, because you were defined just by something exclusive. Like, you had to be fundamentally a Christian, right? And that was the single most important aspect of it. Then, even in this system, so as we were saying before, there was a lot of bigotry, a lot of xenophobia, right? If there is something that was inherited from Hellenic culture that was so since ancient times, was xenophobia, right? So racism didn't exist at the time. It's a much later invention, but don't think that the world before the pseudo-scientifical racist ideologies was actually a world that didn't discriminate people on the basis of their look or their origins. It was a brutally violent, just as racism could be, right? Racism is more of a structural ideology before, more structured systems. But the form of sheer violence imposed for discrimination were brutal. And the empire in itself had always been very, on the wake of this broader Hellenistic past, and for the same nature of the Eastern Mediterranean to be, a melting pot in many ways. But therefore, there was a cultural standard here that was seen as a gluing factor, right? As something that could keep all these elements together, as the Roman Empire had been, right? But what is interesting about the Byzantine Empire is that it didn't properly have a we could say a Greek landmass in this sense. The most important part of it was fundamentally Asia Minor and Constantinople. Greece already, in many ways, didn't think that Greeks proper liked Constantinople very much, right? The inhabitants of the Hellas, were, trying to, sometimes they were even repressed. The word, that tells you how much this empire was something beyond national identities in many ways, because it didn't really look in face of anyone. It just was about that power, it was about holding that system, sticking to those forms that had made the empire what it was, right? And then everybody theoretically could join, right? So as long as you were Christian fundamentally, and you were educated the Byzantine way, you had these values and culture that backed your fitness to the rule. And for the rest, the lower echelons of society were much more multi-ethnic, right? And actually was plenty of Muslims there too. Like, just think about trade. Like, so the idea is that it was not an exclusivistic, like, if you're not Christian, you can't even enter here, right? There were Jews, there were Muslims, there were pagans of all sorts coming from the steppes, for example. So the system was tolerant, as not in the modern sense, right? In how it emerged in Western Europe from the second half of the 7th century. That is our idea of tolerance, but it was tolerant in the sense that obviously every universal empire is co-opting external elements if it even wants to hope to maintain power, because if you don't open your your structure to be joined by others, if Rome had extended its citizenship, it would have not come out of Latium, right? And that was probably what had rendered possible for the empire to exist in the first place, right? And probably the cultural exclusivism at some point of the Byzantine elites had something to do with the, let's say, even the attritions that happened later on. Naturally, this was fueled by the distrust that naturally existed because of foreign threats and this constant pressure put on Constantinople itself. So there was a xenophobia from both sides. It was that was growing in many ways, and this happened also in the West, within the same Western. So once again, let's be very, very careful with categorizations that are, generally speaking, not a very good idea, historically speaking. Now, the point of Greek or Hellen were reevaluated as terms in the 13th century by work of the Greek humanists that wanted to fundamentally recall the classical past, but this was a purely cultural operation, right? It hadn't no tie with reality and the current reality in use, right? The subjects of the empire continued to define themselves Romans, right? They didn't call themselves Greeks, like they weren't the like Greeks that were travestying as Romans to to still maintain that they had the imperial thing, but we're really Greeks, right? Let's show the others what we're capable of doing. No, these people were Romans, and Greek was an insult, right? And after the fall of Constantinople, 1453, the patriarch of the city was the patriarch of the Romans, right? Greek is an epithet that is often used in the Middle Ages with defamatory intent towards the Byzantines, right? The definition recurs frequently, especially with the within the protocolar conflicts with the West, when the Germanic sovereigns claimed the qualification of Roman emperors, calling in sign of contempt the Eastern colleagues simply as emperors of the Greeks, or also kings of the Greeks, right? And telling the truth, Basileus, as we were saying before, actually means king, but of the Romans at least. So there was actually a deep, when this identity stuff is very fascinating, because it's naturally influenced not just by as you understand, as a purely identitary awareness that is never touched by others, right? It's possible that this overemphasis on the Roman character at so many levels, and the absence of further changes, was also fueled by this contrasts with other realities that were really pressing hard on the Byzantine Empire and disqualifying and trying to delegitimize it and to diminish it. And this is not that, of course, they didn't realize that these were actual Romans, right? They knew perfectly well that the Byzantine Empire was a power that was capable of still conferring great authority. Right, for a long time, the Western rulers tried to be recognized as peers by their Byzantine correspectives, and they didn't receive that. Right, the Charlemagne was called emperor, but not of the Romans. Right, and there was definitely, by the Byzantines, and there were many other events in which there were a lot of diplomatic work, even just making these marriages work, etc. And they never quite got it right in the West about that, and the Byzantines wouldn't let them to. because otherwise at that point it would have conferred them the legitimacy that they would have needed. So this is very important to understand even the distrust and why of all of these emphasis on what was like, were they Romans, were they Greeks, were they this and were they that, because that it still exists today, because it really stems back to the day, right? I'm starting to think that, of course, I mean, I've always realized it, but that a very important reason why there is all this overemphasis on the fact of the Romans. So the thing is that because we have continued in a way this kind of clash of definitions rather than concentrating on the historical substance of these realities, right? That is not that these terminological problems are not connected to them in a way or another, but just they're not the entirety of the thing, and the entirety of the thing is pretty big for just wasting time with the definition in itself. So the idea of Romanity was at the base of the political system of the Byzantines. For all the 1,000 years, the empire was considered pretty unanimously the continuation of Rome, with a right and sovereignty over the territories that had belonged to it. The eventual foreign domination within the borders, let's say boundaries of the Roman Empire, was deemed as illegal or fruit of an usurpation, considered that it was a duty of the Roman Emperor to reconquer all the territories that had formerly belonged to the Roman Empire. So up to Scotland, to the Persian Gulf, theoretically, Constantinople should have retaken everything. This was like, naturally, towards the low Middle Ages, all of this emphasis on the Roman thing, etc., kind of fell in a way, because of course up to the 12th century, like, the Byzantines were really a kind of a superpower for those time standards. After that, it's not that they could ask for much, right? Even of recognition, they were an important power of sort, but they didn't represent a threat, right? Theoretically, up to the 12th century, even the Roman papacy could have been reabsorbed by the Byzantine state. And don't think that the popes were close to the option, right? Of course, with certain specific measures, like, essentially a decentralized papal power in Italy, but still recognizing the emperor of Constantinople as the legitimate one over the Holy Roman one. The point is interesting because it makes you realize how, once again, the thing of the decadence over time is true after all. Like, if you look at, for example, this broader authority / legitimacy of the Roman Empire, if you look at Justinian times, like, I presume everyone, including the Anglo-Saxon party, they actually recognized the empire. They tried to imitate it at all levels. We know it perfectly well. The Franks did it, Visigoths did it. Even the Anglo-Saxons used the term basileus at some point, which seems absurd, but the word was small after all. They throw away every myth about the fact that during the Middle Ages people didn't travel, that news traveled slowly, that people didn't know. They knew everything about everything was happening, and they were pretty cleverly exploiting every opportunity to draw, in this case from a major universal political authority, elements that could fit into it in a way or another, right? It could bring the local rulers at the same, comparable levels. And don't think they went that far. Think about Charlemagne himself, but also look at the councils of Toledo. Look at the Visigothic church and how the thing was modeled from Constantinople, but in its ecumenic councils. But the point here is that naturally the thing went slowing down, right? By the 6th century, the Mediterranean is still a Roman lake. By the 8th century, it's definitely not anymore. that's something that wakes, internationally speaking. Even less it is, I don't know, by the by the 11th century there's a revival, but by the 13th century it's most evidently not again. So there is gradually a substantial decadence that is to be observed in relative terms, rather than just absolute in some circumstances, that compared to the other powers that were rising. This is probably a very important key of interpretation of the thing that we're touching a bit before. That is, you have to compare this power to the others, right? And you can't say, these were just the true Romans, and then the rest I don't care to learn. This is something you have to measure compared to other political realities, other universal ones. Ever thought that the Abbasid Caliphate, especially the Umayyad Caliphate at the beginning, was much more Roman in nature? For example, the Abbasid, that was much more Persian influenced, right? The models were those ones, and those were large powers. The same goes for, think about the Kingdom of France in the 13th century. When Constantinople fell, right? That you can't say that, it doesn't count, it doesn't matter. The Hohenstaufen in the 12th century, those guys were about to reunite East and West. Constantinople was about to fall under Henry VI. Like, they didn't attempt to do that, but the Swabians were about to reachieve the thing. So there is a lot going on that you can't exclude. You can't just depreciate because it was not the true empire. It was a papal creation. It was a barbarian empire. The Romans feared them legitimately, also because they knew perfectly well that those were Christians, and that's another important thing that is often overlooked. That an ecumenic empire technically should protect all the Christian community. By the 11th century, there's the schism proper. There is the realization that whatever is happening in the West, it's not controllable. Yet you can't rise again to have some influence in there, but don't think you're going to retake the whole thing. The times of Justinian are over. We have to cope with the fact that there are powers that are capable of even claiming from their own side the Roman and Christian legitimacy in an imperial sense. To this conception that is properly political, it was added since the first Byzantine time a religious aspect that completed it, forming an homogeneous whole. Right, the fact that the empire was a divine design, right? The idea of perpetua sanctio, that in a way, tended to crystallize the empire, right? Tended to make it believe as an unchangeable system, at least from an ideological point of view. Think about the Codex Theodosianus or the Corpus Juris Civilis. So the idea that the Roman law was unchangeable, was perfect, and therefore it couldn't be changed. This was one important cultural limit, after all, that is to be better studied yet in the practice, but that corresponded now also to a world that was definitely changing towards that direction. But that when the world came back, rising again in many ways from the 8th, the 9th century, etc., could be a burden for the same empire because it couldn't adapt so easily to new forms that might have been more competitive, actually. And God, in this sense, had elected the Christian people as depository of its will, right? And as a consequence, the empire was eternal because wanted by God, and universal because Roman, right? So you understand how they had built the thing. This created, and that's why also the Westerners weren't that far from right. That evidently this was not didn't correspond to the reality anymore. There was something here that how to explain the floating of this system, right? You couldn't even explain it. But what about Christians out there that believed and accepted in other authorities of imperial value. Of course, this is deeply complicated because the papal creation of the year 800 and eventually the Gregorian reforms were something definitely very eccentric, unusual, and by many standards illegitimate, right? But they still stand from, as we were saying before, especially in the idea of conferring the imperial dignity, more of recognizing the imperial dignity, and that's in fact was also the base of the struggle for the investitures, because actually that was never clearly defined, right? What was that was recognizing what was it? God, was the mediation of the Pope? In that case, was it the mere fact that the Franks had conquered half of Europe by themselves? So that is something that was never resolved. Like the Byzantine Empire, in this sense, remained always more coherent from the standpoint of a political, institutional, and legal continuity. So definitely that was a more legitimate empire than before, right? People criticize this position, say, yeah, no, because the capital was shifted to Constantinople, so they abandoned Rome, so it's not a Roman Empire anymore. That's actually not a very good point, frankly, because now the video is excruciatingly long. We don't have very much time to explain why it's the case, but it's obvious that the first, Constantinople became a capital de facto, and was claiming naturally a superiority over Rome, but at that point more like in terms of imperial power over the spiritual authority of the bishops, including the papacy. So even the territorial matter was blurred, because the papacy technically didn't fit in any empire. Like, it's not that they were properly part of the Holy Roman Empire at some point. They were the papacy. They were the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, and that's all what they had. Naturally, the Holy Roman Empire wished to claim that the papal territories were part of the empire after all, but legally the question, even in the relation between the papacy and the emperor, was very different, and the papacy stood as something unconquered, fundamentally. And theoretically, therefore, still belonging to the Roman Empire, right? This is very important also for the history of the papacy itself, but we will have to talk about this in another frame. So there could not be, according to the Byzantines, naturally any other emperor after the one of Constantinople, right? That at this point had become naturally an important symbol on its own, but just by sheer habit, right? It's obvious that this was a major city. Constantinople was one of the largest cities in Europe, and it it embodied a power that could make those claims. And that was enough, right? It doesn't have to be right or wrong. This is what people really don't much understand, because you see the real problem here is, even historiographically speaking, is debated at the origins. Nobody cares very much for this by the 14th century, the 15th century. Guess why? Because the Byzantines didn't have much of a power there to claim more than much, right? They, on the contrary, the emperors sometimes even converted to Catholicism just for receiving aids from the West. The rest of the populace at home didn't actually agree at all, and there were also serious problems regarding that, but that's politics. That's not something that stands imminently somewhere, right? Because you prefer, you invent, you decide to interpret history arbitrarily like that. Just need to know what happened, and that's already a challenge on its own. But the important aspect here is that this idea, an ideal indeed, survived tenaciously within the Byzantine world, right? Even when the reality of facts rendered it as unproposable, right? And it was always inspiring. This spread, claim of unicity of uniqueness, right? This idea that the empire, after all, especially when it was seeing itself from the within, was something unique. And it really was. This is the important part of the story, that every power has its foundation, and objectively the Byzantine Empire, or better the Roman Empire for sure, was really the continuation, the direct continuation of the previous empire. There's no other way of putting that, right? You can't say, not because they exchanged the capital, they went away, they started speaking Greek, even in the official titles, the thing, doesn't mean anything. That's the same polity. It's the same polity, and naturally you can say, well, but there were differences. Of course there were differences, and as there were from Scipio Africanus to Caesar to Hadrian, from Hadrian to Diocletian, and that's exactly the point, right? Things change, and this is what most people can't get over. That things change. They need this constant security. They need simple explanation, monofactorial systems or dichotomic systems, and all these continuous idea that since something was in a way once, now it must continue to be so, because it doesn't matter how things change, because we can't help them to change, even independently from what people actually do, but just because time and space oblige us to do so. I will entrench myself into this unchangeable ideology, and I will take it back with me until I die. For what, ultimately? To have lived wars, to have not taught much intelligence to people who will remain after you, and not having made an effort to understand that you can definitely sympathize for one system, you can appreciate it, you can defend it from legitimate accusations. It's fine to point out that the Byzantine Empire was misrepresented for centuries, as it's fine to say that every system, historically speaking, is misrepresented by definition. But in fact, you can't be dogmatic about the concreteness of reality. This channel doesn't give a damn. Like, I personally care about where you come from, for example, because humanly speaking, there's a minimal warmth that arrives from this thing. I'm not a very expansive person. I don't know how to say that, but to the sake of my historical reflections, I absolutely don't give a damn about where you come from, what you believe, or what you don't believe, or what's your political ideology. I talk here not to flatter any contrary nation, religion, atheism, left or right. I don't give a damn about it. And that's what every person who is generally interested in history should at least try to do. And I can't, because obviously everybody's biased. So it's obvious that I do things for the sake of something myself, but at least I try not to. Which is an enormous deal. If you step into history with immediately pretending that you have to turn it your own way because you have that agenda, we're done for. Right, so this is what I would like to do. It's a highly provocative video. I realize it. It's essentially, if you haven't understood it in the end, it's actually a defense of the humanity of the empire, which I wholeheartedly stress. But at the same time, bitterly criticizing whoever thinks that just by this judgment, everybody can, get dogmatic about it and stop inquiring, stop wondering, stop using a critical sense, right, in saying, but maybe I should know a bit more about this thing, as I think I need to, in my opinion, right? And this will definitely not be the last video about Byzantine history, because put in these terms, like in what is Byzantine and how does the change occur, we will have to do a lot of that. For example, we haven't talked about the periodization, we have talked about the actual, like, the linguistical problems, the titling, the administrative forms. There is a lot to do, and we'll have to do it in other videos, but this was just for, pointing out from my personal experience what can be observed, at least that goes on out there, right? That what is that brings certain phenomena to happen. Why do people like or dislike, care or don't care, judge or don't judge, and why it's a problem? Because ultimately history is also based on this thing, so you can't ignore it. Like, history is a part of the wall, right? There is not a story. This is what I always tell. It's not a story that someone knows right 100%. You can't even tell how right or wrong it is, or the thing. History is history. Stories are tales. History is the research. History is the value. History is what you find out. Then you can have a narrative, because of course you have to tell the story in a way or another, but you should tell the story of a history, not the story of a fairy tale, just based on whatever makes you feel confident with yourself, or secure, or ideally satisfied about something. You can't. It's very common. It's what the Byzantines did. The Byzantines at some point, they were cool as long as they were open, were capable of accepting that reality changed, that there was always a problem next to another that they needed to stay open in order to solve. At a certain point they stopped doing that, because they started saying we are the best of all, we got it anyway because we are superior to others, right? Intellectual superiority is a double-edged web. And you stop being intellectually superior as long as you stop questioning what you presume to know. And the Byzantine Empire, that we call like this for this very reason, in a way, died in this very way. So remember that beginning of the video when I started talking about today's world. Don't give anything for granted. In your life, don't give anything for granted. Anything. Because nothing is, and this is what we are to live with all the time. Alright, so for now I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.